Texans wide receiver Nico Collins is a top 10 wide receiver in your dynasty leagues. We'll explain why on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also check her out over on Yahoo. On today's show, we're going to talk about Breece Hall doing nothing for your fantasy teams. We're going to talk about some injury updates, including to Rashee Rice, Anthony Richardson, and Christian Watson. But Kate, let's start off with some positive news because we've got a lot of the negative we're going to talk about later in the show. Nico Collins continues to absolutely crush it for the Texans. Another monster game in week 4. He caught 12 passes for 151 yards and a touchdown on 15 targets. Why isn't he a top 10 receiver in your dynasty leagues?
I mean, I don't think you can come up with a great reason, Marcus. Like there's no reason we shouldn't be looking at Nico Collins as a top 10 dynasty wide receiver. The track record has been pristine in terms of production, right? Like we couldn't have asked for more over the past 2 seasons. It obviously, 4-game sample size this year, but I mean, dating back to last year, ranks only behind CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill in terms of regular season receiving yards. Dominant from the touchdown perspective. And guess what? He's tied to a touchdown or, a quarterback we're going to assume is going to produce a ton of touchdowns. He's efficient. He offers just about everything that you could possibly want from an elite wide receiver. Ranks only behind Tyreek Hill in terms of yards per route run, ranks ahead of him in yards after the catch per reception. Like, Nico Collins, from a statistical standpoint and analytical standpoint, you can't really pinpoint a reason why he shouldn't be ranked top 5, let alone top 10. And you look at the situation, he's tied to a great rookie quarterback. You look at the contract, he's tied into that team long-term with that rookie quarter or the second-year quarterback who's going to be there for the foreseeable
on a rookie contract, right?
Like, yep. You love everything about the situation. I guess like the only thing that's holding you back is the crowded receiving core. I don't really think it matters. It goes back to that old adage, like targets are earned, and Nico Collins earns those targets.
Again, I want to mention Stephon Diggs is not a 1-year deal. They brought him in really just to help with the offense this year. We got to assume he's going to move on after this year. I love Tank Dell, but as much as I love Tank Dell, he can't stay healthy, right? You look at the receivers that are being drafted ahead of him currently on Dynasty League football. He's being drafted as wide receiver 15. Okay, I'm looking at like Tyreek Hill, wide receiver 10, Garrett Wilson, wide receiver 8. And those guys are both big names, but Nico Collins is just outproducing both of those guys. In the case of like Tyreek Hill, he's 30 with a super unstable quarterback situation, right? Garrett Wilson is young, but another unstable quarterback situation because he's playing with a quarterback that's 40 and that's a free agent after this year. In terms of production, age, and situation, I mean, there's not many receivers that are in a better spot than CJ Stroud.
Let's keep going down that list. You mentioned a couple of interesting names. I agree. I think you can make the argument there for Garrett Wilson, Tyreek Hill. Again, we just have the track record of production. I think what it comes down to is kind of this bias that we have toward the draft pedigree, toward, in Nico Collins's case, I think it's the fact that it was the 3rd-year breakout, which isn't as exciting as a Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr. situation where you step onto the field and you're immediately productive. How about Chris Olave, wide receiver 11?
Oh, that one's not close. And I you know how much I love Chris Olave, but that one's not close for me.
It's not close for me either. Okay, Jalen Waddle,
Not close.
Drake London,
Not close.
Brandon Ayuk.
Not close. That's what I'm saying. I think he's pretty comfortably a top 10 receiver. It's just how high up. I understand the arguments for Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr. because they're both not significantly younger, but younger, right? And they're on rookie contracts. Not that that matters for your fantasy teams, but they aren't going anywhere. One of the more difficult names would be like AJ Brown, who is still, he's amazing when he plays. A little older than Nico. He's 27. In a good offense when he plays, that one I struggle with. But I'm like wide receiver 8 is kind of where I'm thinking Nico needs to be slotted in here.
Yeah, I mean, last year, again, not even necessarily like an ideal circumstance for Nico Collins here. Let's not forget, he was playing with a rookie quarterback last year and still posted 4 separate top 5 finishes on the year. Again, was one of the most efficient wide receivers in pretty much every statistical metric that you can be measuring him in terms of, some of these sticky stats that can predict long-term success in the league. Nico Collins shined in all of those areas, and I think he's proving that 2023 was not a fluke. He is here to stay, and I think you'd be doing your dynasty rankings a disservice if you had him anywhere beyond like wide receiver 8 at this point.
Yeah. Let's go through really quickly some other positive notes from Sunday. What do you got?
I want to shout out also another wide receiver. Let's talk about George Pickens here for a second, because the Steelers offense, they didn't pull out the win. And yes, I know I have my terrible towel waving behind me, but watching George Pickens, I have always been a big skeptic, right? Like, not a guy that can create separation, not a guy that is consistent on an every down basis when you call his name. But I think yesterday was just kind of this big breakout game that we've been waiting for. He's been a big play monster. A lot of plays have been nullified to this point in the season, but I think we're seeing George Pickens come into his own as a top end wide receiver. And when the touchdowns start coming, you have to imagine that they're going to start coming. I just think he's looking more and more like a true wide receiver 1 for his respective team. And that wasn't a role that I have always projected would be the role for him.
I want to mention a couple other receivers. Jordan Addison, first game back from the injury. They didn't ease him into this offense. He had 81 total yards, 2 touchdowns. He just is going to crush it because he's so good at beating single coverage. And Justin Jefferson's going to get a lot of attention. So Jordan Addison right back into being an every week starter for you. And Sam Darnold, for that matter. Like, look at Sam Darnold just absolutely feeding his top 2 guys in Jefferson and Addison. That offense is really good to watch. Kate. The other one I wanted to mention really quickly, Brian Thomas for the Jags. I know not a lot's going right for Jacksonville right now, but it does seem like they hit on their first round pick at receiver. Brian Thomas, 6 for 86 and a touchdown on 9 targets. Also added in 13 yards on the ground. With this team being 0-4, I think it only makes sense to just feature Brian Thomas and let him get going. I wouldn't be surprised if Jacksonville trades one of these receivers to maybe a team that we're going to talk about at the end of the show. But I think Brian Thomas Jr., by next year, we're talking about pretty comfortably a top 20 dynasty receiver.
For sure. Another wide receiver. Again, this was like, we've had a very dry spell to start the season in terms of receiving production, passing production. So I feel like now that we have it, we just have to keep talking about it. I think it's getting really hard to ignore Jaden Reed and his connection here with specifically Jordan Love. Each of the games that he's played with Jordan Love this year, week 1 and week 4, 130 plus receiving yards and a touchdown. He's got that rushing upside as well, just, getting him basically generating touches and seeing what he does with them in his hands. Like, Christian Watson down with another injury. He has had trouble staying on the field from a health perspective. Jaden Reed is so comfortably this team's wide receiver 1 when Jordan Love is the quarterback. I think it's getting really hard not to continue moving him up the ranks. He's got the draft pedigree. He's got the immediate production. We are seeing this again, wide receiver one upside. He was a top 12 wide receiver in the second half of last season. We're still seeing him as a top 12 wide receiver here with Jordan Love at quarterback to this point. Like right now, being drafted on average in the latest batch of Dynasty ADP, wide receiver 31. I just think that's too low.
Can I mention Dontavian Wicks or no? We got to move on.
Dontavian
Wicks.
I know
caught
you
2
love
touchdowns.
Dontavian Wicks, but you cannot deny that Jaden Reed
Yes,
is
Jaden Reed's the better
wide
player,
receiver
but
one.
Wicks might be stepping up a little bit. He had 13 targets, most on the team coming out of week 4. Just putting that in there. All right, Kate, let's talk about some players that had discouraging performances in week 4, including Breece Hall. We'll get to him next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. I absolutely love Gametime. It's the only ticketing app that I use for my favorite live events, including football games. Gametime now has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier and faster than ever before. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so that you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of tickets. I love that you can see exactly what your seats are going to look like and what the field is going to look like before you buy your tickets. It's so convenient. Plus, they also have the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account. Redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are talking about some of the biggest winners and losers coming out of week 4. And Caleb, we have to start with the Jets. The Jets offense was abysmal against the Broncos. They scored 9 points in this game. Aaron Rodgers couldn't beat the blitz at all. They just had nothing going on downfield. But what's more discouraging is that Breece Hall had 10 carries, Kate, for 4 yards. His longest run of the day was 3 yards. So it wasn't like he had, a bunch of little runs. He had 1 3-yard run, lost yardage on a bunch of these other runs, only added in 2 for 14 as a receiver. Really quickly, since last year, in the last 17 games that he's played, he's averaging 3.8 yards per carry. His success rate, which is what a lot of these teams use to judge whether a running back is effective or not, is the worst in the NFL among all running backs over the last 17 games. I'm officially concerned about Breece Hall.
I think all of those concerns are pretty justified. And now I'm also kind of trying to temper my panic level because, again, you mentioned not a great offense right now. It's one-dimensional. There's not much going on. And to be clear, this is also up against the Denver Broncos, who are probably an underrated defense. So I get it, bad team, but probably an underrated defensive unit at this point. So again, I think that's all fairly justified. The concerning part for me is the fact that Braylon Allen just looks so much better, and things just look easier for Braylon Allen at this point. And I don't know if this is maybe a product of the fact that, yes, he is the backup running back, fresher legs. Teams might scheme a little bit more differently for the backup running back coming in. You're not necessarily game planning for Braylon Allen in the same way that you might game plan for a Breece Hall. And they're also just different types of running backs. So I don't know what to make of it. There's a lot of confounding factors here. I don't think they have enough depth in the passing game to really take that much pressure off the run. I don't know that this offense is in a position where I can fairly evaluate Breece Hall, because I do think from a talent perspective, you're not going to argue that Breece Hall doesn't have it. I'm struggling.
it's not that I don't think he doesn't have it, but I do wonder, like, if Braylon Allen doesn't look I think Braylon Allen looks good enough that he's going to continue to be a featured part of this offense. Now, maybe that featured part is only 10 touches some weeks, maybe it's 14 touches other weeks. But if Breece Hall isn't getting the workload that we are expecting and he's not being efficient and effective, then why are we drafting Breece Hall as RB2 in dynasty leagues on an offense that we don't think is very good, right? Maybe this Jets offense can be average, but we don't think this offense is very good. It seems like now we're getting caught up in some of the draft capital and some of the draft hype and some of the big plays that we saw from him as a rookie. But again, over the last 17 games, you're averaging under 4 yards per carry. And now you're not getting the workload to kind of support bad efficiency. What are we doing here?
I mean, again, I think all of those things are fair points, but I also want to remind you this is a running back that, like, despite the box score not being super efficient, to close out the year, last 5 weeks of the season, he was a top 3 running back in 4 out of those 5 weeks. So, like, he won you your fantasy championship because
If
he
you made
did.
it there.
Like, and again, like, through the first 3 weeks of the season, RB8, RB4, RB12. And yes, week 4, I don't know what his exact finish is going to be. We still have Monday Night Football pending. This was a disaster, but I'm trying not to panic too much because, again, recency bias should favor you being in on Breece Hall and recognizing that upside. Like I said, last 5 weeks of 2023, he was a top 3 back in 4 out of those 5, or yeah, 4 out of those 5 weeks. I get Braylon Allen is in the mix, and there are reasons to be pumping the brakes. I just, like, let's talk about the other running backs. I mean, like, I think if you're not in on Breece Hall, like, who are you in on at
Well,
this
and
point?
that was going to be my other point is let's talk about Bijan Robinson, right? Because that's the other running back that's being drafted next to Breece Hall, right? Bijan Robinson in week 4 had 7 carries for 28 yards. Tyler Algier had more rushing attempts than Bijan Robinson, and it makes sense. 8 for 60. He was just the much more effective running back. I think the reason why I'm more in on Bijan is I like this offensive line significantly better. I like them playing in a dome, and I think they are going to have more high scoring games on offense than the Jets are. And I mean, honestly, Kate, I'm not encouraged about either of these players after what we've seen for the first month. Um, I'm not saying I don't want any part of them in dynasty leagues, but when you're talking about like startup drafts and those guys are being drafted inside the top 5, I can't do it.
I mean, here's the thing, Marcus. I think what the conversation that we're having isn't a Breece Hall conversation at all. I think it's a conversation about the state of the running backs right now. Because, like,
Yep.
I'm looking at all of these options. You want a top tier running back? Okay. Like, there's not a lot of, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of stability because even these guys with elite pedigrees, the elite athletes like Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, like, these are the guys that have kind of formally solidified themselves inside the top 4 for the dynasty conversation. And none of them are doing the things that you want. So, like, I think this is a lesson for me. And if I'm believing in what I'm seeing to this point, this is a situation where, again, I'm just kind of taking the lesson to fade the running back position
Mhm.
and, like, go back to the foundations of, like, my most steadfast belief when I'm building a dynasty roster, I want a core of wide receiver depth. Like, I want to build my dynasty rosters on the wide receiver position and then fill in the rest as I go. And what we've seen from the running backs to this point is making a really good case for that to be a continued process here.
I also want to mention another running back that's being drafted inside the top 10. I almost said Trevor Etienne, but that's his brother over at Florida.
Soon, maybe
Travis,
soon. I don't know.
yeah, Travis Etienne, 11 carries for 50 yards. Had 1 catch for 10 yards against Houston. Fine, whatever. Tank
Tank
Bigsby,
Bigsby.
7 for 90. And it just was so obvious that he was the more explosive running back in this game. And there was a shot in this game of Etienne on the sideline with his helmet off, and they were just riding with Tank Bigsby in some of the most important moments of this game. Maybe this is just Jacksonville throwing everything against the wall, trying to figure out how to stop this skid with Trevor Lawrence. But man, you don't want to see your backup come in and instantly have success. And that's what happened for ETN on Sunday.
That's what we're seeing a lot. And let's not forget, like, Tank Bigsby, not a name that necessarily came out of nowhere. Everybody was all in on Bigsby last year. And, as a rookie, just kind of fell flat, was just abysmal. But this was a guy that was already earning these very favorable reports, even though they didn't come to fruition on the actual football field last year. So, like, I feel like we're just starting to see, like, Tank Bigsby better at football than we thought. And to be fair, I think, like, you can make the opposite argument for a Travis Etienne versus a Breece Hall. At least Breece Hall has, like, done something for your fantasy team outside of the touchdown component. Travis Etienne really hasn't.
No, the running back situation is rough in your dynasty leagues right now. It's not fun to figure out what you're going to do there. Okay, let's do some injury updates from Sunday. Unfortunately, it was another heavy week with injuries. Let's talk about Rashee Rice and Anthony Richardson next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Then you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. We got 2 Monday Night Football games tonight. That's an excellent time to go over and make your first bet. I kind of like the Dolphins to get a win tonight with Tyler Huntley at quarterback. Go place a little $5 bet on the money line. Get your $200 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. That is FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Now, go make your second listen, the new Locked On NFL show with 2 shows every single day. First, the madman Tyler Rowland kicks you off in the morning with a double shot of NFL espresso. Then stop by the barbershop with Tony Wiggins for some real NFL talk. Find Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Kate, let's talk about Rashee Rice because this one is a big bummer. It is believed that he has a torn ACL. He's getting an MRI today to confirm. Doctors are pretty good at identifying the MCL or the ACL tear without the MRI, but this one's a bummer for a lot of reasons. He was going to have a fantastic season. We were talking about him potentially leading the NFL in yards and receptions, but we also have to mention there's a good chance that he's going to be suspended for the 2025 season or a majority of the 2025 season due to his accident that he had this offseason. What do you do with a wide receiver like Rashee Rice, who you might not get back until Thanksgiving of 2025?
I mean, this is a guy that you're probably, if you're in a win now window, you're going to see what you can get for him in terms of, like, moving on and sending him to a rebuilding roster. Like, if you're a rebuilding team that, I mean, you're not going to compete. Obviously, this is a window, I think, to get the Chiefs wide receiver 1. But, obviously, I mean, he's useless to you right now. And he doesn't really have any sort of guaranteed. It's not even just the medical timeline. It's really unfortunate because when we've talked about Rashee Rice as of late, I've had the conversation like, hey, I'd rather know that a player is going to be suspended and know that kind of guaranteed timeline versus an injury when you don't really know how that's going to affect their overall timeline. And now it's both. So I think if you are a contending roster, you shop him to some of these rebuilding rosters and see what you can get. And you need to, unfortunately, move on quite quickly because we're in the thick of it.
I was doing my dynasty rankings this weekend, and I had Rashee Rice up to wide receiver 13 in my latest rankings. Now I'm looking at names like Jaden Reed. I mean, you got to assume that you would rather have Jaden Reed over Rashee Rice in your dynasty leagues, correct?
Pretty easily. Yeah.
Yeah. What about Lad?
Like, for instance, if you could swap them 1 for 1 right now.
You do it. Yeah. Lad
Yeah.
McConkey.
That one's harder for me, but I guess Lad McConkey. Like, at least Lad McConkey's on the field for the foreseeable future and catching touchdowns.
Yeah, it's rough. Yeah, that's a big bummer. The other one we wanted to mention is Anthony Richardson. Just another game where he's dealing with an injury, Kate. What do we do here?
It's just so hard, Marcus, because here's the thing about Anthony Richardson. He plays like a bull in a china shop. Like, he's reckless. And it's kind of funny because we said, Jaden Daniels plays like Johnny Knoxville. We need to start referring to Anthony Richardson as Mr. Johnny Knoxville of the Indianapolis Colts. Because here's the thing. He suffered that hip injury, right? Came out and actually came back into the game after suffering that injury, aggravated it again on just another reckless run where he was taking contact that, like, we should have known was going to re-aggravate any sort of hip injury that he's like clenching onto. I don't love to see that, like, yeah, he's already dealing with an injury and then, we're just kind of throwing the body to the wolves once again.
Okay, he's played 8 games in the NFL and he's left early in 4 of them.
Yep. I mean, I don't know what you do with that. Obviously, the upside's tremendous. The Steelers had no answers for him when, and that's, I mean, kind of part of that Anthony Richardson experience. The highs are so high, and then injury, then inaccuracies, then boneheaded turnovers. I don't know what to make of Anthony Richardson in my dynasty rankings. It's a lot when you put all of those circumstances together, because you don't even know if he's going to be on the field, let alone which version of Anthony Richardson you're going to get.
And a couple other just really quick injury updates before we go. Christian Watson dealing with a high ankle sprain, likely to go on IR. Unfortunately, this has just been the story of Christian Watson's career. Cannot stay healthy despite all of his talent. Jonathan Taylor suffered a mild high ankle sprain, whatever that is, against the Steelers. He wanted to come back into that game. I wouldn't be surprised if he misses a game or 2. I believe the Colts have a bye week coming up. I'm going to guess they exercise caution there, but a brutal week of injuries, Kate.
Brutal week of injuries, but hopefully we're here to help you continue to bounce back, take advantage of maybe that Christian Watson injury, go get you a Dontavian Wicks. That's
there you go.
The Marcus special here. But I mean, the injuries have been really terrible this season. And I feel like we say that every year, but this especially feels like just as bad as ever. But we're going to be here all season long to help you keep those dynasty rosters here in contention.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Go follow the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. You can go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Modjuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.